Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe have spent more than a year criticising one another, building rival parties, and competing for many of the same voters. Now they are discussing whether to work together to unite the right. And because this is British politics, the proposed reconciliation has already produced an argument over who did or did not make a telephone call. So, is this the beginning of a powerful new alliance? Or a Reform UK and Restore Britain simply discovering that splitting the same vote is much easier than sharing the same stage? To answer that, we need to understand why Rupert Lowe made the offer, what he is demanding from Nigel Farage, and why electoral cooperation may be logical even if personal cooperation is anything but. Rupert Lowe entered Parliament in 2024 as one of Reform UK's first MPs, representing Great Yarmouth. But his relationship with Nigel Farage and the Reform leadership deteriorated rapidly. Lowe was suspended from the party in March 2025 following allegations concerning his treatment of staff and an alleged threat against the party chairman at the time, Zahir Youssef. Lowe denied the claims and the political dispute became bitter and personal. Lowe later created Restore Britain, first as a movement and then, in February 2026, as a political party positioned to the right of reform on immigration, crime, culture, and the size of the state. That matters because Restore is not drawing its voters evenly from across British politics. YouGov has found that its support comes largely from people who previously backed reform, with immigration overwhelmingly the dominant concern for both groups. In other words, Reform and Restore are not two completely different shops. They are competing stalls in the same political market, selling similar products while arguing about whose sign is more patriotic. The immediate trigger was the Greater Manchester mayoral by-election. Restore Britain finished fourth with 8.7% of the vote, while Reform finished second with 21%. Labour won. You cannot simply add those two right-wing totals together and assume every voter will transfer neatly. Voters are people, not supermarket loyalty points. But the result illustrated the danger. Under Britain's first-past-the-post system, a smaller party does not need to win many seats to have a major effect. It only needs to take enough votes from a larger rival to change who finishes first. Restore has generally polled around 3 or 4% nationally. That sounds small, but when many constituencies are decided by a few thousand votes, 3 or 4% can be the difference between a Reform MP and a Labour, Conservative or Liberal Democrat MP. Lowe therefore offered Farage what he called a common way forward. He argued that their personal disagreement should be set aside to prevent the right from defeating itself. This was not, however, an unconditional peace offering accompanied by flowers and a slightly awkward handshake. Lowe attached 5 major conditions. First, he demanded mass deportations of people living in Britain illegally, explicitly including women and children. Second, he called for much tighter legal immigration rules alongside bans covering the burqa, cousin marriage, Sharia courts, and halal and kosher slaughter. Third, he demanded a referendum on restoring the death penalty. Fourth, he proposed welfare reductions intended to force greater self-sufficiency. And fifth, he said former Conservative ministers should be excluded from any future government created by the alliance. That final condition may prove especially difficult. Farage has been trying to broaden reform by welcoming prominent Conservative defectors and presenting his party as capable of forming a government. Lowe's demand would exclude some of the very people Farage sees as evidence that reform is becoming a serious national force. So the offer is not simply, let us stop fighting, it's closer to, let us stop fighting, provided you accept my programme and leave several of your friends outside. Farage's first response was cautious but not dismissive. He said reform would need support beyond his existing membership to win a general election, and that he was open to people who shared the party's aims on borders, the economy, and democracy. On the 3rd of August, he went further. He said he was open-minded about a conversation with Lowe, agreed with much of what Lowe supported, and would begin negotiations if Lowe generally wanted talks. But Farage also made clear that he would not abandon his allies. He specifically defended figures Lowe's conditions appeared designed to exclude. Then the peace process became rather less peaceful. Farage said he had reached out to Lowe and suggested a call. Lowe responded by accusing him of lying, publishing the wording of a message and saying no call had arrived. The alliance intended to overcome personal rivalry had therefore reached its first public row before the first proper negotiation. This does not prove a deal is impossible, but does reveal the central obstacle with impressive efficiency. There are several possible versions of this alliance, and they are not equally likely. The most dramatic would be a merger, with Restore absorbed into Reform or both parties creating a new organisation. That appears unlikely in the immediate future. Both leaders have their own parties, supporters, donors, and political identities. More importantly, both are accustomed to being in charge. A second possibility is a formal electoral pact. Reform and Restore could agree not to stand against one another in selected constituencies, divide target seats, or endorse whichever candidate appears strongest locally. That would be easier than a merger because it would allow both leaders to preserve their organisations while reducing vote splitting. A third possibility is informal cooperation. Councillors could work together, candidates could quietly step aside, and the parties could coordinate attacks on Labour while avoiding direct criticism of one another. Lowe has pointed to cooperation in Norfolk as evidence that this can work. The likely shape of any deal is therefore not one grand party of the right, it is more likely to be a patchwork of local arrangements, mutual non-aggression, and selective candidate deals. Less a political marriage perhaps, and more two neighbours agreeing not to park across each other's driveways. Electorally, cooperation could help Reform. Recent YouGov polling has placed Reform around the low 20s, competing closely with Labour and the Conservatives. Restore's 3 or 4% could be decisive in a significant number of marginal constituencies. A pact could also produce a clearer message for voters who currently see Farage and Lowe competing over who offers the tougher programme on immigration and national identity. But there are serious risks. First, an alliance could push Reform further to the right at the exact moment Farage is trying to persuade millions of former Labour and Conservative voters that his party is ready to govern. Policies such as the death penalty referendum and bans on religious practices may energise Restore's core supporters while alienating voters Reform needs in less ideologically committed constituencies. Second, pacts are difficult to enforce. Local activists may refuse to support a rival candidate. Restore members may distrust Reform's leadership, while Reform figures may see Restore as a smaller party demanding a remarkably large price for cooperation. Third, the Conservatives remain part of the equation. Uniting the right sounds simple until you ask which right. Reform, Restore, and the Conservatives overlap, but they are not interchangeable. A deal between Farage and Lowe could further weaken the Conservatives, or it could frighten moderate centre-right voters back towards them. Finally, combining two vote shares does not automatically combine two electorates. Some Restore supporters are motivated precisely by their rejection of Farage's leadership. Some Reform supporters may regard Lowe's programme as too severe. Political arithmetic is rarely as tidy as the people presenting it on television would prefer. The biggest barrier may not be policy. Farage has said he agrees with much of Lowe's agenda, and the two parties clearly draw from overlapping constituencies. The real problem is authority. Who chooses candidates? Who controls the money? Who sets the manifesto? Who appears in the televised debates? And most importantly, in modern British politics, who gets to stand in the middle of the photograph? Farage has built political movements around his own leadership for more than 3 decades. Lowe created Restore partly because he rejected the way Reform was being led. Asking either man to accept a subordinate role may be more difficult than agreeing another immigration policy. That is why the early dispute over the phone call matters. It seems trivial, but it shows how quickly questions of trust, status, and public presentation can overwhelm shared political interest. So, can Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe unite the right? They can probably cooperate. The electoral incentives are obvious, and Britain's voting system punishes parties that divide the same pool of support. A limited pact, selected non-compete agreements, or local cooperation would make strategic sense for both sides. But a genuine merger is far less likely. Lowe's conditions challenge Farage's attempt to broaden Reform, while their personal history makes even basic communication unusually combustible. The most likely outcome is therefore not complete unity, but negotiated coexistence. They may agree to stop damaging one another in key seats while continuing to compete over the direction and leadership of Britain's populist right, and that may be enough to matter. Because, in a fragmented election, the difference between victory and defeat may not be whether Farage and Lowe become friends. It may simply be whether they can remain in the same political room without restarting the argument over the telephone. Do you think Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe can put personal animosity aside and cooperate for the good of the country? Please consider liking this video, and for more political news, history, and the context behind the story, subscribe to the Nelson